How many of you have ever wished that you were perfect, or maybe just a little bit closer to perfect? I can tell you that as an Asian American, being a perfectionist is kind of like second nature to me. Though to be fair to my parents, they had nothing to do with it. They actually said, we'll be happy with you if you just try your best. But if you think about me as a third grader, the first year that my school gave us letter grades, I realized that if I studied enough and if I was careful enough, I could basically get straight hundreds on everything. I think that year, my report card was straight A pluses except for one A, and that A really hurt me. And then, as I got to high school, I felt like these pressures amplified even more. In high school, you think about things like college admissions and scholarship applications. And what do you get told? You get told, take the most rigorous course load that you can while still making all A's, and have lots of extracurriculars, be well-rounded, and while you're at it, find your spike. Find what makes you unique and special and will stand out from the rest of the crowd. No pressure, right? And also while I was in high school, I had this one senior when I was a freshman. Against her, I felt like everybody paled. She was the person who had all the ingredients of perfection. What do I mean by this? First of all, she was extremely nice. All the teachers, all the students liked her and regarded her well, and she was president of the student government. Second of all, she was beautiful. She had this really long, thick hair, big blue eyes, and in her spare time, I know that she worked as a model of all things, because I would see her in local newspapers and magazines modeling clothes or being beautiful. Third of all, she was good at sports. She was captain of the varsity volleyball team. And then maybe most crucially or most important, she was just absolutely brilliant. She was that person who got into all the honor societies. She got her perfect 1600 on her SAT, was a National Merit Scholar, went to an Ivy League school, and then while she was still an undergraduate, started having professional success. And to this day, she's still successful in this area. And in the midst of all this professional success, she kept on studying. So she not only graduated from that Ivy League school, was a Fulbright scholar at a top school in the UK, and then went back to another Ivy League school to do her PhD. But you know what? On top of all this, because she's a really nice and good person, she's successfully married, has beautiful children, who I'm sure are just as perfect as she is, right? So it's easy for me to look at myself and compare myself to her both then in high school and now, and just realize, I can't measure up to this level of perfection, and I'm never going to measure up. And in this world of expectations that we have, whether it's from society or culture, or even our parents or friends, ourselves, it's easy to measure or try to measure our worth against how much can I accomplish, or how perfect can I become. So if you've ever spent time reading or watching or listening to self-help or motivational material, you may have heard statements like, oh, well, perfection is a moving target, or strive for progress, not perfection. And I think there's some truth to this, but I wonder, what if we change our understanding of perfection? So that's something that I think would be really interesting to share with you all today, how Aristotle has helped me think about perfection and maybe how to pursue it in a way that is actually healthier and more helpful. So remember my high school classmate, that senior? By all means, she met all of society's expectations and benchmarks for perfection and beauty and social status and accomplishments and athletics. And I think that she represents kind of this idealistic form of perfection. So where does that come from? In philosophy, and Western philosophy, specifically from Plato, it comes from his idea of the theory of forms. We could spend a lot of time talking about the theory of forms, but maybe we can reduce it a little bit to a fast enough explanation for here. So if I ask you all to think of a chair in your mind, most people can do this. You'll have a chair in your mind, but if you compared your pictures of a chair with somebody else, maybe it would look different. Maybe your chair would be a different color. Maybe it would have different kinds of legs or different kinds of arms. maybe it would be made out of a different material. And then if we talked about, okay, so what do you use a chair for? How would you give a definition of a chair? You say, okay, it's a place to sit. But is it only a place to sit? Can you do other things with a chair? Yeah, at my house, chairs are often used to hang jackets on or to use as a step stool. And you know what? You don't have to just sit in a chair. You could sit on a table. You could sit on almost anything. You could sit on the ground. So what is it that makes a chair a chair? For Plato, he'd say, it's because there's some sort of higher form that has the prototype essence of a chair, and that is why all of us can think of the chair and what it is. And this extends to higher concepts, like that of what is beautiful, or what is good, or what is perfect. So you're drawing everything to the nth degree, and that is the form of the type. So in this way, perfection is an absolute. It has no room for imperfection, and you draw it out as far as it can go. And so that's what I think most of us have in mind when we think about perfect. However, Aristotle comes in, and Aristotle, you'll know, is Plato's student. But he actually completely disagrees with Plato's theory of forms. First of all, he says, our world here is reality. There's not a higher truth that exists in the knowledge and in conceiving of things in their higher forms. In fact, he says, knowing the right things isn't a virtue, as it is with Plato. Just knowing the right thing won't make you have a happy, flourishing life. Rather, you have to think about flourishing in terms of your practical life here and in the way that you act. So he proposes instead the doctrine of the mean, which I think is really interesting because he says, the Olympics, you have all these athletes competing, and those are the people who are eligible to get a medal. They're the ones who are actually doing things. It's not the person on the side who's the most beautiful or the strongest, but it's the actual doing. So he finds perfection actually in the practice of virtue, and he locates that virtue as that point on the target. It's the sweet spot. Let's unpack that a little bit more. So when you are seeking perfection, you are seeking to align all of your attitudes and your feelings and behaviors towards this rational end, towards what is good and kind of the higher purpose that your life is holding. So he would say, for example, that courage is not just drawn out to the end power like Plato. Courage isn't just the absence of cowardice, but it's actually found as the balance between two vices, the vice of excess and the vice of deficiency. So while you're right, courage is not found in cowardice, the vice of deficiency, not having enough courage, it's equally as damaging to courage to have too much fearlessness, to be rash and to rush into things even when you should be slower and not so rash. So you get this picture that perfection is not just always the end of the extreme, but it's actually found where you have a sweet spot. So that, I think, is also really interesting that Aristotle talks about anger. For a lot of people, anger might seem like a vice, and it certainly would be for Plato. But when you come to Aristotle, he would say, well, you can express that in a perfect and in a virtuous way. There are actually situations where it would be wrong for you to not get angry. And there are these situations where you can express anger in an appropriate way. So it can be expressed perfectly or in line with a perfect virtuous person. If you're angry, say, at the right person, for the right things, in the right amount, for the right amount of time, and you express it in the right way. So what does all this mean? How does this relate to my quest for perfectionism? I think when I think of Plato, he and his theory would say that knowing the form, knowing the highest form is a virtue and should allow you to be able to meet that. And no matter how much I know about that one student I thought was perfect, I just couldn't match what she did. I could pour more and more energy into trying to study harder or trying to accomplish more, but there is a limit to that. But Aristotle's approach instead takes this very practical idea that everybody has their own circumstances. So perfection is not always the same because it's going to change based on the circumstances. It's always in that sweet spot of where all those continua intersect. So if I could go back and I could talk to my high school self, I think I would tell her, you know what, you need to go back to what your parents said, that it's okay to try your hardest, because what perfection is about for you is not about trying to be the best at everything. Actually, in Aristotle's theory of ethics, he doesn't care who is the most beautiful person or who is the smartest or the most accomplished. That doesn't come into his conversation at all. Instead, he says, what are you going to do with what you have, with who you are, and dare I say, in the midst of even your limitations and your constraints? So how can you care for your soul, for your spirit, in a way that will allow it to flourish the most? So that means I would have told my high school self, you don't need to do things just because it seems like this is the right thing to do. Just because everybody else is engaged in this extracurricular activity doesn't mean it's right for you. Is this going to help you be more of the person that you were designed to be or need to be? It would also look like telling my high school self, you know what? It is equally bad to sleep too much as to sleep too little. But you need enough sleep to nourish your body and to keep doing the right things. Aristotle's theory also is very social because it talks about how we relate to each other and sustain a community. And so, sometimes being a good friend is more important than your grade on a test that doesn't ultimately matter. So, as I think about Aristotle and my own journey with perfectionism, I'd like to propose that sometimes being perfect isn't about being the best or striving for an ideal that doesn't exist, but it's actually learning to live with who you are in your circumstances to flourish, not only as a person who has a purpose and good work to do, but a person who is very much needed in their community and who will have a better future. So there